Mic check, mic check. Is that too loud or is that decent level? I'm getting thumbs up around the audience. Good level, good level. Awesome. You can't hear me. Higher, higher from the back. Higher from the back. That's gone up as loud as it can, but that's better. Okay, I've got thumbs up from the back now. Hello, everybody, and welcome, and Happy New Year to all of you. From all of us here at Hull Minster. My name is James Cameron. I'm the Heritage Manager here at Hull Minster, and I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you to this Heritage Talk. I see some new faces, I see some old faces, but I'll say the usual spiel. This Heritage Talk series is something that we've been doing bi-weekly since about May of last year as part of our 600th anniversary celebrations at Hull Minster. It allows an opportunity for historian experts, academics, former professors, or just local people with a passion for history to share what they know with you all. Unfortunately, the next part of my introduction is usually sort of written for me, but this is unusual because I'm the speaker. I usually have a guest speaker who I sort of introduce to the podium and they sort of do their thing, so I'm not sure whether or not I should be telling you my credentials or anything, or how this is one of my most anticipated talks that I've given or whatever. So I think it's probably just appropriate if we crack on with the talk. At this point, I usually elicit an applause from the audience for the guest speaker, so... Oh, it always works. Good. Right. I want to begin this talk with a summary of what's at stake here. The talk you're about to hear on Gassy Jack Deighton is probably the most detailed and complete telling of this man's life, maybe anywhere in the world, in the last 5 to 6 years. This is partly me believing in the research I've done for this talk, but sadly, a large part of this is due to circumstance. The city of Vancouver, Canada, where this man was once hailed as a founding father, and where his legacy is most strongly felt, has recently begun the process of disowning this man's story. In 2022, his statue, pictured, the only one of him ever made to grace the streets of Vancouver, was torn down. Not through discussion or due process, but violently and through protest. Since that statue's been torn down, there's been virtually no word as to whether anything will replace it or where the statue will end up. This man and his remarkable story, from Hull to the gold rush, to the founding father of Vancouver, is at risk of being lost to time. And so I feel it's my duty as a historian of sorts to try to preserve his story in the only other city in the world that might relate enough to his story to care about it. And that is his hometown, his birthplace of Hull. For those of you who have attended these talks regularly, you've either heard my accent or you're hearing it for the first time now, or you've heard the occasional mockery levied on me by some of our guest speakers. You will know that I am Canadian and I am from Vancouver, British Columbia. This is a subject matter that means a lot to me. And truth be told, there's not a lot in common between Vancouver and Hull. Ethnographically and demographically, they are worlds apart. Their histories are not at all similar. But they are intrinsically linked by the man on your screen now. The Hull-born founder of Vancouver's Gastown neighborhood, which would later go on to become Vancouver, John Deighton, better known as Gassy Jack. This presentation will be in 2 parts. The first part will explore Gassy Jack during his life, his story from Hull to the gold rush to the founding father of Vancouver. And the second part of the presentation will be the story after his death, and I think it's a really important story worth exploring, because it's how that story's been interpreted, which is why we're at risk of losing his story to history. So this is a presentation on his life. Just know that the story is still being written today. His legacy, its impacts, and the discussions around it far outstretch the years of his actual life. And before I go into his story, I need to give a massive thank you to a member of the Hull Civic Society, James Robinson. He's written a book about Gassy Jack, which there are some copies actually up at the front here, which you can obtain from him, I've been told. Without his research, this presentation would be a lot more boring. So big thank you to him. And let's begin at the beginning. Or before the beginning, in fact. Gassy Jack, his father, was a man called Richard Deighton, and he was born in Escrick, which is just a stone's throw to the south of York. Now, Richard was a gardener, and as you did back then, you married quite young. And he began to start a family with a woman called Jane Mason, later Jane Deighton. She was from Sandhutton, just northeast. They got married in 1815, and between 1815 and 1828, Richard and Jane must have gotten along quite well, because they have 9 children. 4 of them, though, die quite young, many of them to the cholera outbreak of the mid-1820s. The 5 oldest surviving children, the eldest 3 of them are all girls, Anne, Maria, and Jane, and then the youngest of those 2 are brothers, Thomas and Richard Mason. Remember those names, they will come up later. Richard's family was likely of meager wealth, but the death of Richard's parents changed all that. Richard's parents were quite well off. They had a farm in Escrick, and so when they died, Richard suddenly found himself in a lot of money, in part because he was the only person there to inherit the will. So he makes a decision, having come into this wealth in 1817, to move away from gardening and begin his new life in the honorable trade of shopkeeping. He and his wife and his family in 1817 pick up their stuff, move out of Escrick, and they move to Hull, where they open not 1, but 2 shops down present-day Brook Street, on the current site of the Prospect Shopping Centre. Now, it was in the Prospect Shopping Centre that you would be able to find the plaque to Gassy Jack Deighton. However, it has since been removed, and I've only just been given it about 5 minutes before this talk. The reasons for which will be discussed later. I spent 2 weeks looking for that thing, and If you're interested in the specifics, the address of the Deighton family, was 4 and 6 Brook Street, but you won't find their houses there anymore, having likely been destroyed by the bombing of the Second World War, and having since been replaced by the Prospect Centre. Anyways, Richard moves to Brook Street with much new wealth in his pocket, and he has a pretty cushy life for about 13 years, but then he makes a mistake because he tries to get away with something that he really can't. Because in 1830, he has a fling with one of his shop girls, and the result came 9 months later. As John Deighton, the man who would later be known as Gassy Jack, is born out of wedlock. So John Deighton is, I suppose, the bastard child of the Deighton family, the odd child out and the runt of the litter. But he was afforded one privilege in his early life. He was baptized in this funny old building. He's baptized in this very church, Holy Trinity as it was then, Hull Minster as it was now, likely by the very font that you would have walked past to get in here. On his birth record, his mother is recorded as Jane Deighton, which is a lie. Jane was not his mother. Being baptized here is about the only privilege he had in his early life, especially when compared to his older brothers, Thomas and Richard Mason. John's 2 brothers ended up being educated at a private institution at the Trinity House Navigation School on the site of Trinity House just across the road from here, while John, unfortunately, had to make do with a board school down Brunswick Avenue in Schullcoats. Despite being given the short straw by his family, he was quite an intelligent young lad, was John, especially with numbers. For this reason, despite his disputed heritage, his father wanted him to stay in Hull and work with the family business. But despite his upbringing in Hull, John never really seemed like the lad who would stick around for long. And upon turning 16, he literally takes the first boat leaving. See, John's older brothers had both become apprentice officers in the Navy, and eventually the 2 of them would become master mariners and sail the globe. Richard Mason even served with distinction as a ship's captain on board an American ship called the Shalimar, which took emigrants to Australia. Whether it was because of jealousy of his brothers, pure wanderlust, or perhaps because he had spent so much time as a youth around the Hull docks watching the sailors, John decided that he was going to join the Navy as well. So in 1846, having only just turned 16, he leaves Hull as a first boy apprentice on a British ship, and he wouldn't return to Hull for another 7 years. John's initial ventures on British vessels were not short hops either. John learned the trade of seamanship on these long-haul voyages that took emigrants from Hull, Liverpool, and London to America. He worked 12-hour days on shoddy British vessels. It was probably a rude awakening for such a young man as John. That said, though, it probably would have been very character-building. And for better or for worse, a lot of his interests later in life came from the stereotypical interests of British seamen. Coin, women, boozing, ideally lots of all three. And on these long hauls, a proficiency as well for very, very good storytelling. After the first 2 years of these voyages, John began to hear rumblings of an opportunity halfway across the world, taking place in the United States, and his mind begins to wander again. In January of 1848, a man called James W. Marshall is working in a mill in California, and in one of the great coincidences of history, finds gold in the rivers of California only days after California becomes an American state. They've only just acquired it from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Mr. Marshall cannot keep his mouth shut for very long, and such is the beginning of the California gold rush. The big winner of the gold rush was the city of San Francisco. It grew about 25 times its size in the 8 years of the gold rush. It's as if Driffield suddenly morphed into Newcastle in only 8 years. And it's in the ports of San Francisco that word of the gold rush came around, and eventually back to John Deighton. It was a slow burn until John managed his way to California, but he made his first major step in that direction by leaving the British Navy for the American Navy instead. He registers as a U.S. seaman in Baltimore, and allegedly he quite enjoys his time in the American Navy. The American vessels were kept in better condition than the British ones at this time. He joins an American clipper ship, which is a sort of brigantine-style vessel, called the Invincible. And lo and behold, its first voyage is from New York to San Francisco. It's a long haul from New York to San Francisco. The trip took 4 months, bearing in mind there's no Panama Canal to get through. So we'd have sold the long way around. But during this trip, John is promoted to third officer. And perhaps it's this promotion that means that he does not jump on the gold rush at the first opportunity. John actually stays loyal to the Invincible for another 2 years, joining it for voyages to China, Hawaii, Hong Kong, Argentina, Australia, until eventually the Invincible came full circle and wound its way up in London. John temporarily left the Invincible at London and returned to Hull for shore leave for the first time since he had left as a 16-year-old boy. Now a 22-year-old man, still young, but having experienced so much of the world now up to this point. He would have been a completely changed man from the person who left Hull. He stayed in Hull for a few weeks with his family, where allegedly he spent an awful lot of time spouting stories at the Old White Hart, which happened to be near his brother-in-law's hatter's shop on Silver Street, his favorite stomping grounds. But John remained in Hull for only a moment, and in February of the same year, he returned to London and he returned back to the Invincible, which was setting sail again for San Francisco. John left the shores of the UK that same month, and for the rest of his life, he would never touch British shores again. Upon arriving in California, John joined a group of fortune seekers in the dusty, hilly, and very, very warm Sierra Nevada goldfields. This is only a couple hundred miles north of the Mojave Desert and Death Valley, USA. So this is very warm, tiring work, especially for someone from East Yorkshire. He found no luck panning the rivers, so John and his crew decided to work in the mines of the Sierra Nevada. And wouldn't you know it, John and his team strike pay dirt. They strike gold and they come into possession of somewhere in the region of $5,000 worth of the stuff. It's about $250,000 in today's money. You don't know how far that would have got you in the Wild West USA. Now, at this point, the miners that John is working with make a lapse of judgment because they think that John is trustworthy enough to go and deliver the gold to San Francisco, hoping to use the money from the gold to further develop their mine and make it even bigger. So John is entrusted with quite a lot of money on his way to San Francisco, where he cashed in what was asked of him, and then, much as a sailor probably would have done, he decided to blow most of the money on saloons, prostitutes, booze, anything that you can think of. According to James Robinson, he eventually returned to the mine with the Mexican woman on his arm, a rotten old bulldog, and less than half of what was expected of him money-wise. But that's the weird thing about John Deighton, is that he does return to the mine. He has a degree of accountability about him. He always did say that he never knowingly robbed his fellow man. But he did return to the mine, and he apologized to his peers, but they were less than pleased with him. And so they kick him out, and they threaten him with death if he ever returns. Needless to say, he never returned. Now, all this work in California must have taken place over about the span of 5 years, because it wasn't until 1858 that John would leave California for good, sensing his next opportunity. He's always an opportunist, was John. Luckily for him, it would be this opportunity by the Fraser Canyon where he would really make his name. The Fraser Canyon gold rush is to British Columbia what the California gold rush is to California. In fact, as if on purpose, the epicenter of this is San Francisco again. The governor of Vancouver Island, James Douglas, sends a shipment of gold to San Francisco to be minted, seeing as Vancouver Island doesn't have the means to mint its gold yet. And as soon as the shipment arrives and word gets around about where the shipment has come from, and sensing California's gold was beginning to dry up, many of the old California fortune seekers, the 49ers as they were called, suddenly rushed north of the border, with John Deighton among them. Now, the process was simple. The miners would rendezvous on Vancouver Island at the British outpost of Victoria. I went to school in Victoria, but it looked quite different to that when I went. Anyways, the miners would rendezvous in Victoria, and they would pay just $1 for a prospecting license. And then they would treacherously make their way down the Fraser Canyon and seek their new fortunes. About 70,000 people made their way to British Columbia this way. John Deighton, technically speaking, was not one of them. No, he thought the registration process and paying $1 for that license was a load of junk. So he sails around Victoria and he beelines straight to the Fraser Canyon. Registration be damned. Like in California, John fancies his luck in the mines, but unlike in California, he finds no similar luck this time. He puts a few years in of hard work with good people, but the riches this time do not come. What was becoming more apparent to John, though, was that he really had the gift of the gab. Well, he didn't find gold in Canada. He found lots of excellent company, who he regaled with his tales from his time at sea or in California. Some things do not change, though, and he is apparently still a massive boozer, but that seems to make him only more popular with his mates. Now, John has made a lot of mistakes in his time. We've already covered a few of them. But behind all that is a bright young man who his father once saw great promise in. And with the mining project looking like it's going nowhere, John decides to make a really important decision, one of the best decisions of his life. He drops out of prospecting, and he gets a job as a customs agent. It's the perfect job for him, as he'd had experiences with ship's customs before and potentially how to circumnavigate them. He was still quite good with numbers, that Skullcoats education not going to waste. And he did a very good job in this position during his time in what was then Queensborough, but is now New Westminster, circled on the map. It's kind of a part of Vancouver, but back in those days would have been quite distant. While in New Westminster, John works that gift of the gab, and he somehow manages to fandangle an entire steamboat off of a man called Billy Moore. John then becomes the first steamboat pilot on the Fraser River on a ship called the Henrietta. Allegedly, according to a newspaper, the first and best pilot on the river. although you would be the best pilot on the river if you were the first. Thank you. You can come to more talks. John's greatest strength, though, and his greatest flaw, was his opportunism. And just a couple of years later, the Caribou Gold Rush caught John's attention. So he leaves this very good gig at New Westminster for yet more work in the mines. But again, he comes up empty-handed. He then returns to New Westminster not long after, and returns to his life of steamboating people up and down the Fraser River. It was during his time as a steamboat captain, John begins to realize a few things. First, he really likes being his own boss. But he also realizes that life is getting pretty lonely, being just him. So sometime in the mid-1860s, we don't know exactly when, John Deighton gets married to a First Nations woman who would go on to help John on his steamboat as a cook. Now, marrying Indigenous or Indian women was a common thing to do at that time. For many colonists, in fact, it was an absolute necessity. The gold rush had brought so many men westward to California and to British Columbia, but not many women. The women who did ended up working in brothels, many of them. As such, for a lot of these men to start families, they ended up taking wives from Indigenous tribes. Some of these marriages came about by fine means, but many of them likely had deeper undertones. In regards to Jack's marriage, we don't really know how he came about his wife. We don't know how old she was. We don't even really know her name, or what the process for their marriage was. In James Robinson's book, he assumes the most likely route, which is that Jack paid a sum to the family of the bride, and that the Squamish people would conduct an ancient wedding or binding ceremony where they would wrap the married couple in blankets. After some time, John and his wife would save up enough money to build, open up, and operate a shack saloon in New Westminster, which is beginning to develop into a bustling riverport town. John named his bar the Globe, and it was quite a hit, particularly with sailors and lumbermen. So as you can imagine, it was quite riotous clientele, not helped by the fact that it had an equally riotous barman to boot. In fact, John told so many stories, so often and so loudly, that one of his patrons stood up and named him, in front of his peers, a gassy bastard. Whether or not he knew John was actually a bastard, I don't know. But John didn't seem to mind the nickname, and thus his patron stuck with it, and Gassy Jack was born. The Globe was colloquially known as Gassy's Place thereafter, and it was a real community center in this fledgling town. Jack seemed to be riding the good life in his saloon for a while, but as fate would have it with Gassy Jack, it does not stay that way for very long. For starters, it's around this time that Jack becomes afflicted with a condition that causes his legs to swell and makes breathing quite difficult. His history of boozing and working in the mines probably catching up to him. Wanting to ease the pain of his legs on a holiday, one day he goes to Harrison Hot Springs, and Jack proceeds to make the cardinal sin to end all cardinal sins if you are a Canadian business owner, and he entrusts his business to an American. Now, I'm obliged to say that the American pictured is not the American who ran Gassy Jack's bar, but I have to imagine it wouldn't be that far off. Sure enough, Jack is away from his saloon when the 4th of July rolls around, and said American owner decides to celebrate by giving away all of Jack's booze for free and using the money in his bar to buy fireworks, which he then uses irresponsibly, and it burns down the Globe. Jack returns to New Westminster, devastated. He's lost his business and his family home, and he owed quite a lot of money to creditors that it suddenly looked unlikely he'd ever be able to repay. But as we've mentioned, Jack is an opportunist. So crazy Jack Deighton fits his family, his pet dog, some chickens, a barrel of whiskey, and a nephew of his wife's, a young Indigenous man we know only as Big William, onto a canoe, and together they rowed down the Fraser to who knows where, with Big William likely doing most of the rowing due to Jack's ill health. Eventually, the Deighton family settle on the shores of the Burrard Inlet, which is just above the word Vancouver on this map, and at the current site of modern-day Gastown. At the time, this was a completely desolate place, save for a nearby sawmill owned by a Scottish man from Alnwick, William Stamp. The sawmill had no settlement attached to it. There was no shops, saloons, houses, anything, only some shacks to shelter some of the workers, and a small harbor where ships would sail up and fill up with the timber produced by the sawmill. Where most men would have seen nothing, Jack saw a very profitable business opportunity. Like I said with the steamboats, you're always the best if you're the first. And so with that in mind, Jack proposed to Stamp and his boys. If they could build him a saloon, they could drink as much as they wanted. The quote from his sales pitch to the sawmill workers has gone down in local folklore. It goes something like, "If you build me a shack, I will set up a bar. And for payment, you can drink all that you want for free." It turns out they didn't need much convincing, and in not too long, Gassy's place was back open for business. He had named it the Globe yet again, but his patrons didn't care much for the name. On opening day, Jack climbed the roof of his own bar and raised a Union Jack on a flagpole, allegedly proclaiming, "This flag represents all that is good. It has been my chum for 40 years, and I have pinned all that I have on it." It's a rich statement coming from him, who left Britain at the first opportunity, and then left the British Navy at the first opportunity for the American one. But Gassy Jack was nothing if not a good salesman, and prone to exaggeration, one would think. So popular was Gassy Jack that some of his old customers in New West had got wind of his new bar and made the long trek just for his company. The bar became very popular, again with seamen and laborers who would go there to relax after a long day working and filling the timber into the boats. Sailors from all over the world began to make its way to Gassy's bar. The English, Chinese, American, West Indies, Australia, India, you name it. And soon, with all this new traffic, new shops and businesses and bars would open alongside Gassy Jack's bar. It became its own little community, and as Gassy Jack was the town's first ever resident, the town became known as Gassy's Town, further shortened to Gastown. And it really was Gassy's Town. It was such a fledgling, lawless community that Jack did a lot of the old law keeping while he was there, because nothing keeps the peace like an East Yorkshireman with a shotgun. Not long after that, Gassy Jack branches out from bar work and he opens a hotel, Deighton House, of which his wife is chief manager while he looks after the saloon. However, not long after the hotel is built, tragedy strikes, and Jack's wife loses a battle to sickness, possibly cancer, in 1870. While on her deathbed, Jack's first wife makes him promise to her that he would marry her niece, Madeline. Jack very promptly did so, and despite having no children with his first wife, he manages a child with Madeline in just a year. There is a slight issue with Madeline at the fact that she is only 12 years old when she marries Jack, and is likely only 13 when she gives birth to the boy. He names his son Richard Mason, after his late brother who had only died a few years earlier to tuberculosis. Authorities, though, did not officially recognize the birth of the child, as he was considered a half-breed, part European, part Native American. In fact, marriages between whites and Indians were not considered legal at the time. However, if we've learned one thing from Jack, is that he doesn't care much for regulations, and so life went on quite normally. His son, on the other hand, was quite a famous little man. He must have adopted some of the charisma of his father. He's adored by the locals and is eventually adorned with the nickname, the Little Earl of Gastown. So life went on for Jack, but not without difficulty. Madeline was a bit young, or very young, to maintain the hotel business, and his own health wasn't getting much better either. Jack needed help. And so he writes a letter to one of his half-brothers back in Hull, Thomas and his wife, Emma, imploring them to move out of Canada, or move out to Canada. You have to imagine being Tom Deighton, receiving a letter from a brother you've not seen in 20 years, asking you to uproot your entire life and move halfway across the world to a business you have absolutely no experience in. You'd be crazy to consider it, and you'd be twice as crazy to actually do it. But Tom Deighton is crazy. Tom Deighton and his wife accept Jack's proposal, and by 1873 they arrive on the Burrard Inlet and in Gastown, where they begin to help running the bar and the hotel. The letter that Jack sends to his brother, this is a transcript, he would have written it by hand, but this is accurate. The letter that he sends to his brother is one of the best kept historic records we have of Gassy Jack. In the letter, we learn that Jack has hired another Indian boy to help run his kitchen. We learn that the debts that he owed after his first bar had burned down had all been paid off. We learn that as part of Jack's deal to entice Tom to come to Gastown, he promises him, quote, everything he owns in case something happens to him. And we learn that Jack also sent his brother a gift of sockeye salmon from the Fraser River as a gift, which would have worked on me. Now, Tom Deighton was a master mariner, so it's fair to say he would have seen most of the world by the time he ended up in Gastown. But apparently even he was surprised by the shabby lawlessness of Gassy Jack's little settlement. The coarse, rough way of life did not really endear itself much to either Thomas or Emma. And they also did not endear themselves very much to Gassy Jack's young Indigenous wife or their half-breed child. Emma, in particular, seems to rub Jack the wrong way. While she runs the bar, she insists that nobody drinks past midnight, which loses him a lot of business. She bans gambling in the saloons on Sundays, and she goes as far to hold a Methodist service in the lobby of his hotel. This did not go over very well with Jack, unsurprisingly, and himself and Thomas and Emma have a massive falling out, so much so that it causes Jack to leave Gastown, his own place, in a cabin. He leaves in a huff to a cabin, which he still owns out in New Westminster. He comes back into possession of another steamboat called Onwards, and he spends a little while steaming up and down the Fraser again, newspapers hailing his arrival. To say that Jack held Thomas and Emma Deighton in contempt is probably an understatement. He's so riled up by this that while he's in New Westminster, he is writing his will, and he cuts Thomas and Emma and the entire Deighton family out of his will, leaving everything now to his son, and by extension to his wife. It's not long after he leaves Gastown, though, that he receives word that Tom and Emma are giving his business a bad name, and so he returns to Gastown not soon after. He returns to Gastown to kick his half-brother out, and in yet another heated argument, a couple points of contention come up. Thomas and Emma implore that Gassy Jack's son is not his own, and again they throw that B word back at Gassy Jack. Bastard child. It is, even with all that time away from family, still a moniker that haunted him, even halfway across the globe. Thomas and Emma left Gastown and they settled in Victoria, but not before having siphoned much of the money out of Jack's businesses to open their own shop. Jack single-handedly tried to keep his businesses open. He borrowed lots of money just to try to keep these places afloat. And perhaps it's the stress of trying to keep his business open, combined with the fact his illness was getting no better, that means that eventually he loses the will to live. Only a couple of months removed from when Thomas and Emma leave for Victoria, Gassy Jack would die of illness on May the 27th, 1875, aged only 44. His funeral attracted hundreds, and he was finally laid to rest in New Westminster's Fraser Cemetery. His will, which left everything to his young son, and by extension to his wife, was not respected. And neither the little Earl of Gastown or Madeline received much, if any, of what Gassy Jack had left for them, likely due to their marriage being considered illegitimate. So despite Jack's best efforts, all the money that he saved up in his life ends up in the hands of Thomas and Emma Deighton, his nearest family. Only 6 months later, Jack's son, the little Earl, still very young, also dies. His now widow, Madeline, still only aged 17, would return to her tribe, where she would marry one of her cousins and live on a reserve until finally passing away in 1948, likely aged 90. She outlives her husband by almost 75 years. She was even interviewed once in 1940 by Vancouver's first ever archivist and one of its flagship historians, a man called J.S. Matthews. It is one of our best sources regarding Jack and Madeline's story. Thus ends the story of Gassy Jack in life. I think from a storyteller's perspective, it's this tremendous story of opportunism. Jack has not often dealt a winning hand in his life, whether that be his upbringing, being chased out of California, having his business burned down, or being done over by his family, the only family he ever put trust into, but who still manages to leave this incredible legacy halfway across the world despite all of that. It's this amazing case study of the gold rush. And I think for people in this city of Hull, a great story about a man who made it big elsewhere, all while championing many of Yorkshire's most desirable qualities. With his death comes the second part of this talk, which will discuss his legacy, what he leaves behind, what happens to Gastown, how he's been remembered in the newspaper, his statue, and why we're now at risk of losing this man's story. The Globe Bar and the Deighton Hotel would continue to operate after Gassy Jack's death. As you can see from this map, Gastown, officially renamed to Vancouver in 1885, was becoming a bustling little town. By 1886, it had roughly 3,000 people living in it, and somewhere between 600 to 1,000 buildings, which is pretty good going for a place that set itself up around a whiskey bar just 20 years earlier. And its importance was recognized by the Government of Canada in 1885 as it becomes the westmost terminus for the Canadian Pacific Railway. This is a big deal. The Canadian Pacific Railway is a massive undertaking, a coast-to-coast railway meant to link all the major hubs of this very wild and underdeveloped country. So the fact Vancouver is chosen as its westmost terminus is a big deal, and it changes the city forever. I'm spending so much time on the railway because it's the arrival of the railway that ultimately causes this. And if you've read the title of the image, you can see where this is going. Because in 1886, Vancouver and all of its wooden buildings, many of them made by that sawmill, catches fire and is almost entirely wiped out. This is a result of clearing fires started by certain Vancouverites that was meant to clear space for the railway. But Vancouver had managed a dry spring that year, and the fierce winds blew the flames towards the city. And as such, Vancouver, Gastown as it was burnt down to ashes. So Jack's businesses, ironically, are burnt down for a second time due to sheer incompetence. But obviously this time Jack is not around to rebuild it, and thus ends the Globe and Deighton House. The first ever mayor of Vancouver, poor Malcolm McLean, had only been the mayor for a month before seeing his entire city leveled by the fire. He appeals to the Canadian government and to the railway for help, and help quickly arrives. The railway expedites itself to Vancouver. New building materials and new settlers come along the railway, and Vancouver eventually, on the site of Gastown, with the remaining buildings that did survive the fire, rebuilds itself, and it blossoms into the city that it is today. Would it have all happened without the actions of Gassy Jack? Hard to say. Without him, there would have been no 2010 Winter Olympics. There would have been no Stanley Park, its wonderful green landscapes looking over the mountains and Vancouver's skyscrapers. And most tragically of all, there would be no Michael Bublé Christmas album. For better or worse. Gassy Jack's importance to the founding myth of Vancouver was always sort of known, but it was never physically memorialized in the first 100 years after his death. But he was nonetheless in the public consciousness, and his importance to Vancouver was really cemented by an 1888 newspaper article written by a man under the alias of Ancient Mariner, possibly one of Jack's sailing friends. He wrote of Jack, quote, "At some future day, when Vancouver becomes the emporium of the Pacific shores, the name of the first permanent settler will be sought out by historians and given a name as great as that for any, and many thousands have ventured limbs, lives, and fortunes." So Jack was never fully memorialized or physically memorialized until 1970, when a handful of Vancouver businessmen from the Gastown neighborhood thought up an idea to try to promote tourism into Gastown that might help their businesses. And so they commissioned a statue of Gassy Jack from a local artist called Vern Simpson. And without city council permission, much like Jack probably would have done, he erects the statue on Valentine's Day, 1970. The mayor of Vancouver is so displeased at this stunt that he orders the statue removed, but the clever businessmen retaliate by signing all the papers needed to keep it up. It was not a very popular statue in its first year. It was actually decapitated. A $50 reward was literally placed on Gassy Jack's head, and 2 months later it was found dumped on its own in a car park. It was moved a couple times. Initially, Gassy Jack's statue wasn't even on a pavement or a sidewalk, but rather on the edge of the Gastown zebra crossing or crosswalk. A pretty unusual place for a statue. So it was moved away from there, and then in the early 1980s, it's finally moved again to its most famous location on Maple Tree Square on its brick plinth. The statue stood in its entire lifespan for 52 years, all while the Gastown neighborhood that surrounded it became one of the most chic parts of the city, full of boutiques, cafes, and as Gassy Jack would probably have wanted it, bars. During those 52 years, the primary criticism of Gassy Jack's statue is that it's a little bit of an eyesore. And it's not the best statue looking at it, but it's got that rugged charm about it. Nobody, apart from Vancouver's tour guides, really think too much about who the statue represents. Or if they do, they don't keep it very public. They keep it to themselves. But in 2019, a short 4-minute documentary produced by the Battered Women Support Services, titled Red Women Rising, made a powerful statement on Gassy Jack, claiming that he purchased his 12-year-old wife, whose real Indigenous name was, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Huahelia, from her family. They also say that Madeline, or Huahelia, ran away from Gastown when she was aged 15, and should therefore be held up as a role model for young Indigenous women, recognizing and escaping oppression. They then go on to say how Jack enabled so many of these themes of colonization, damaging Indigenous lands, and that he should not be memorialized. Some weeks later, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, picks up on this and gives it a mainstream voice. And not much more is written about Jack's statue in the next year. But both this video and the CBC article begin a conversation which begins to bubble under the surface. And in 2020, something really big happens that turns this conversation into a full-on meltdown. It's not COVID. The really big thing is the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, BLM manifested itself differently in Canada, I think, than it did to the States. And to Canadians, BLM became a rallying cry for minorities of all kinds, Indigenous people included, especially in Vancouver, which tries to champion its relationships with Aboriginal peoples. So several marches and demonstrations take place. One of the marches, on the 10th of June, vandalizes the statue of Captain George Vancouver, the man who discovered the Burrard Inlet. The following week, on June 16th, Gassy Jack's statue is similarly vandalized. The CBC gets a hold of a Squamish activist called Sace Wiss, and her language is very strong. She outright calls Gassy Jack a pedophile and calls outright for the statue's removal. She's insistent that Wahelia, and I will use her name as Wahelia instead of Madeline in order to use her real name for the rest of this presentation. She's insistent that the girl have her own statue instead, a memorial her people could be proud of. Momentum around removing the statue grew. A petition received over 23,000 signatures for its removal. And not long after this vandalism, conversations begin to be had between the Squamish people and the people of Vancouver, the city of Vancouver, to remove this statue. From everything I've read, the leadership groups that were leading this conversation behind removing the statue seem quite measured. Both the Squamish people and City of Vancouver being in discussion was, according to Squamish leader Wilson Williams, crucial in order to further ideas of reconciliation between peoples. But unfortunately, those leadership groups were not present for the march that ultimately saw the statue torn down. On Valentine's Day, 2022, this was meant to be a video, but it won't be, unfortunately. On Valentine's Day 2022, exactly 52 years to the day that the statue had been raised as a business stunt in Gastown, a women's memorial march marches through Gastown with ropes and buzzsaws, and it's quite clear that they've decided that Gassy Jack's statue is going to come down. And so it was. Pulled down off its brick plinth and spray-painted red, the color associated with Indigenous women's marches. The falling statue was inches away from crushing a woman, and some protesters even follow up with buzzsaws, trying to decapitate the statue a second time. They're unsuccessful in that, but they are successful in removing the statue, and it has never been put up since. Likely because, according to that Squamish leader, Wilson Williams, the city of Vancouver and Squamish people had already decided the statue was going to come down. It was just a matter of when and how to do it appropriately. So protest or not, his statue's days were likely numbered. The statue is likely still in a warehouse somewhere, still awaiting its judgment by the city of Vancouver and Squamish peoples. The removal of the statue is so important to the city of Vancouver and the way in which modern Vancouver wants to portray its image and its history. This is public history manifest. To remove the central figure behind your founding story is a massive cultural swing for Vancouver and how it wishes to see itself and package itself to the world and understand its own history. And so I think it's important to look into the relationship between Jack and the 12-year-old bride, Wahelia, because it's for that reason that he is torn down at this Indigenous Women's March. I've done as much research as I can into their relationship. And as far as I can tell, using elements of both the written white man's story and the Squamish oral story, here is my best guess as to the relationship between Jack and his 12-year-old wife. Wahelia is in Gastown already by the time her aunt makes her marry Jack, or makes Jack promise to marry her. This is supported by a snippet from that Vancouver archivist I mentioned earlier, Matthews. Speaking about Wahelia after her death, Matthews claims that Wahelia had told him personally that it was her aunt, not Jack himself, that fetched Wahelia from her tribe in a canoe. This also makes sense as to why Jack's first wife would have wanted Jack to marry Wahelia in the first place. The Squamish story, to some contrast, says he buys his wife from her tribe. I think this is also true to a degree. If it's anything like Jack's supposed first marriage to his first wife, this might have been a traditional dowry or a sum agreed that Jack paid to the family. It's transactional in a sense, but I don't think there's much malicious here. There must have been an agreement between both parties. Both stories say that Jack has a child with Wahelia while she is very young, likely only 12 years old, and 13 when she gives birth. Newspapers from 1948, the year that Wahelia died, tried to hijack this and claim Wahelia was in her hundreds when she died, which would have made her in her 20s when she marries Jack. But Matthews refutes this. How much time Wahelia spends in Gastown is a matter of debate. An 1886 newspaper claimed that she split her time between Gastown and her tribe. According to Matthews, she splits time between Gastown and a cabin Jack had built out back, just behind his hotel. James Robinson's book claims that despite having built that cabin, Wahalia was runaways anyways. Ultimately, it's probably a mix of all three. The Squamish story doesn't go into quite as much detail, but they say that she runs away when she turns 15. Again, both stories have truth, because Wahalia would have been 15 in 1873, the same year that Thomas and Emma arrive in Gastown, decry their marriage, and send Gassy Jack overboard. This is what I believe prompts Wahalia to leave Gastown, not Jack. She is almost certainly never in Gastown while Thomas and Emma run the business. Not long after, Jack follows Wahalia's lead and leaves Gastown in 1874. That year, 1874, is the toughest year to guess at what's happening between the two of them. Because we know Jack's in New Westminster with the steamboat, but we don't really know where Wahalia is. My best guess is that she's splitting time between Jack and her tribe again, but it's equally possible she's committing to one or the other. But she must have been in her good books somehow, because she remains in the will, while the Deighton's do not. Jack returns to Gastown in late 1874, but it's unclear whether Wahalia follows him there. Again, she might have been sharing time in both areas. When Jack dies, she knows about it, and she knows that she's in the will to collect something. However, the people in charge of enacting this will decide that she isn't owed anything due to her marriage being considered invalid. And obviously, the son dies only 6 months later. Left with no reason to stay any longer, Wahalia returns to her tribe one last time. She gets remarried, and she lives the rest of her days there. But she seems to have fond memories of Gassy Jack. In his obituary in 1875, she refers to him, allegedly, as a good, kind man. And again in 1940 with that Matthews interview. Wahalia, in her early 80s now, calls him a kind, good man. We cannot find any written evidence that supports a sort of mistreatment between one person and the other. That's the story as I understand it. In a way, it's a really sad story for both of them. For Wahalia, she is made to marry Jack very, very young by both her Jack and her aunt and possibly her family. At 12 years old, there's very little she could have done to get out of it. All this for Jack to die quite young and to be left with nothing in the will and lose her son all in the span of a year. It's a tragic story for her. For Jack, we're talking about a man who grew up in Hull, an ostracized child, always the odd one out. He doesn't really find a home until he literally founds one off his own back in Gastown. The only time he seeks his blood family for help, they betray him, steal from his business, and smear his name. It's no wonder then he leaves the will to Wahalia and the boy. It's likely that they are the only real family he has ever had. To conclude this presentation, I want to give my verdict on the two main questions that need answering, both relating to the primary reasons why Jack's statue was taken down in 2022. The first question is, was Gassy Jack a pedophile? By today's standards, absolutely yes. But by the standards of his time, I can quite literally answer no. As crazy as it is, the age of consent in 1870s Canada is 12 years old. And it is not raised to age 14 until 1890. So Jack is within guidelines here, technically. And what Jack did by marrying an Indigenous woman was a common thing to do at the time. This doesn't make the fact he has a child with a 12-year-old girl any less unsettling. But I don't think the fall here lies with Jack. I think it lies with the lawmakers and administrators that allowed for such predatory marriages to happen. The second question is, did Jack oppress Indigenous people? By accident, I suppose he does. According to that Red Woman Rising video, his running of that bar in Gastown, quote, catered to the loggers and the other men who were doing the work that destroyed and removed the trees and our ancestor spaces, and that catered to the men that violated my women, end quote. So I suppose you could argue Jack was complicit by proxy. But there's nothing to say that Jack himself directly engages in any of this. In fact, he allows for his first wife to run half his business. And she must have been happy enough in the marriage, because you wouldn't want to doom your niece to a marriage that you found unsatisfactory. And he leaves Wahalia and his son in the will while writing his own family out of it. Wahalia never says a bad word about Gassy Jack in that 1875 obituary and in that 1940 interview, at least not any words that are written down. So is Gassy Jack an oppressor of native peoples? It's a matter of opinion. I think he's unknowingly complicit to what his peers are doing, and I suppose you could argue that his bar enables this. But I don't think there's any malicious intent here at all, and I can't find any instance of Jack mistreating Aboriginal communities directly. I don't think that he is a villain, nor should he be considered a villain by today's society. I think there are contemporaries of his that deserve that title instead. In my eye, Thomas and Emma Deighton, who steal from his business, decry his marriage to Wahalia, and profiteer unjustly from Jack's will and to Wahalia's expense. To that point, the lawmakers who decide to go against Gassy Jack's will and leave his native wife and their son nothing. The lawmakers of early Canada that allow for marriages to 12-year-old girls to happen. And most egregiously of all, I think, although it's a bit past Jack's time, the people who started the clearing fires for the railway, destroying so much of Vancouver, but also so much of those native spaces, all in the name of industry. So I do think Gassy Jack is worth remembering. He is not the villain of this story. Rather, he is this one-of-a-kind example of the gold rush. Someone who founded one of the world's great cities off his own back as he desperately paddled a canoe down the Burrard Inlet after his first business went up in flames. He's a self-made man who shook off the moniker of being that bastard child in Hull and made a name for himself. He has flaws, yes, but I think his flaws make him more human and relatable, and I think that makes his story more inspiring. It's a story which I think relates to that immigrant experience in Vancouver. And I truly hope that his legacy can be kept alive. If it's not going to be kept alive in Vancouver, and they have chosen a different direction, then hopefully in the city of his birth, in Hull. Thank you. I feel like I need to leave and then come back so that I can... This is question time, so if anybody has any questions or any thoughts or opinions, the point of this presentation is to sort of leave you guys with your own impression of whether Gassy Jack was a hero or not, or whether his statue was worth keeping up or tearing down. So I'd be happy to hear any of your opinions on this as well. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think certainly the difference in age, because Gassy Jack would have been 40 by the time he marries Wahalia at 12 years old. I don't know how many of these binding ceremonies between these people would have taken place between people of that much age discrepancy, although I do know they happen very young. Like I said, with the sort of idea that he buys Wahalia from her tribe, there was certainly some kind of agreement made between Wahalia's family and Jack for that to happen. But, I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind who's aged 40 should marry a 12-year-old. But if it is, like we believe, on the wishes of his dying wife, then that's just it. That's why it's such a complicated story, and that's why there's so much controversy around it. So, very different back then. Yeah. Well, circumstances were different, right? So Jack, if he wants to keep his businesses alive, obviously they burned down later, but he would have had to have kids with someone. And he's in this gas town neighborhood that's full of seamen and laborers and people working in the sawmills. So it is a different time. It's different circumstances. And that's what makes it such a difficult topic. That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. So there's a lot of misinformation about Jack's story. Oh, what's the question? Sorry, the question was there any evidence of him having prostitutes in his bar? There's a bit of misinformation about Gassy Jack. My father came for Christmas, and I was talking about this talk with him. And he said, oh, wasn't he that guy who had a bunch of prostitutes and was really into the slave trade? And I was like, no. There's no evidence of him having prostitutes at his bar. If you read James Robinson's book, he's apparently quite vehement that he doesn't have prostitutes in his bar, even though he will have engaged with prostitutes in San Francisco and Victoria and et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the slave trade is junk. There's no evidence of that either. But as far as I know, no, I don't think there is any. Yes? We're married at what, sorry? There might be oral evidence. I don't think there will be any written evidence. They did get married quite young, but yeah, it's like I said, it's the age discrepancy which is the main issue here. 12 years old, I'm not sure. But that 12-year-old guideline that the Canadian government set out would have had to come from somewhere, so perhaps it's that. Yes? What's the plaque? Well, unfortunately, the gentleman who brought the plaque in has left. So I'm under temporary custodianship for a while. And then I would be surprised if it ever gets put back up. I don't know if this was removed in 2020 when it was vandalized the first time, or 2022 when the statue eventually came down. But it was up. It was up at some point. But it can't have been up for very long because he brought in the Lord Mayor's Hull 100 book, which has like these 100 figures of Hull's history. And initially, Gassy Jack had been planned to be a part of that book, but he never made it in. So we've seen Vancouver's sort of removing him from the public conscious, and Hull took a similar step in that direction. So the truth is, I don't know what's going to happen to this, but I would be very surprised if it's put up in a public space, for better or for worse, again. Yes? Yes, so his illness that he had, the swollen legs and the difficulty breathing, got much worse. I think that, compared with the stress of trying to repair his open business, probably just caused a steep decline. So yeah, he dies of illness. Nothing else, which is good. Okay, I can do the conclusion bit. Where is the conclusion bit? Thank you all very much for putting up with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this Heritage Talk. As I said at the beginning, we're running these talks bi-weekly on Fridays at the Minster. So if you want to join us for another Heritage Talk, the next one is January 23rd, being hosted by Mike Reimer, who's done a few of these talks. He does a fantastic job, links with the Hull History Centre as well, about women in Hull in the 1600s. Very much an unwritten story for a lot of people, so that will be an interesting one. Before I leave you, I need to do my duties and plug the Minster a little bit. It is lunchtime, so please go visit our Trinity Room cafes for a snack or a quick bite before you leave, or visit our gift shop and grab a memorabilia from my talk if you wish. This is part of our 600th anniversary celebrations. There's not much long left on the celebrations. It technically ends of March of this year, but do keep an eye on our website, our social media, any of the flyers that you get by the front doors, because we always have something big going on. And the last thing I am obliged to say is that keeping Hull Minster open is an expensive endeavour. It's £1,000 a day to keep this place running. It's £365,000 a year, if my math's right. This is a wonderful building that we want to see preserved for future generations, and we do not want to see the Minster go the same way as Gassy Jack's statue. So if you can, please make a donation at any of the donation points across the church. We have online and QR codes if you prefer to donate digitally, and help us preserve this building for the next 600 years. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all again at a talk soon. Thank you. If you would like to hold the plaque and have a read of it as well, it's open hours, so please feel free.